Ever get that feeling? Like you're just bombarded with financial news, economic jargon. It's overwhelming.
It really is. And so often it feels like we're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Right, like why are things happening the way they are? Today we're going to try to fit one of those pieces in. We're doing a deep dive on why banks take on so much risk.
Yeah, even when it seems like from the outside it makes absolutely no financial sense.
We're looking at this paper from the Bank of England. It's called Reputation, Risk-Taking, and Macroprudential Policy.
By David Aikman, Benjamin Nelson, and Misa Tanaka.
This was a working paper, so research in progress. Just so you know, all the ideas are from the authors, not necessarily the official stance of the Bank of England or anything.
Yeah, standard disclaimer there. But this paper, it offers a really different way to think about all of this.
So what we're trying to do today is we're going to pull out the most important stuff for you. We want to see why banks might get caught up in these things called inefficient credit booms.
Basically, lending sprees that aren't really based on solid economic fundamentals, and, of course, how regulators try to stop that from happening.
Okay, so the main idea of the paper is this. Banks, obviously they want to make money, profits, right?
Right.
But they also care about their reputations, like how skilled everyone thinks they are.
Exactly. And this is where things get interesting. The paper talks about reputational externalities. It suggests that banks get really worried about having a bad reputation, and that worry can actually push them to take on even more risk, especially when the economy is doing well and all the other banks seem to be raking it in.
Makes sense. No one wants to look bad when everyone else is doing great.
Right, so they might end up extending way too much credit, just trying to cover up the fact that maybe they're not as profitable as they seem.
Kind of like gambling with their reputation to try and save it.
Exactly. It's a gamble, because it could backfire spectacularly.
Okay, so we've got banks potentially taking on a ton of risk,
Yeah.
even when times are good. Why is this fear of a bad reputation even worse when the economy is booming?
Well, think about it. When the economy is strong, everyone just assumes that a competent bank should be making a ton of money.
Right. It's like the rising tide lifts all boats situation.
Exactly. So if a bank comes out and says, oh, we're not doing so well during a boom,
It's going to look really bad.
much worse than if the entire economy was struggling. The market will think, well, what are you doing wrong? Everyone else is doing fine.
So their low profits get blamed on them, not on external factors.
Exactly. So how does this whole gamble for reputation thing actually play out?
Yeah, how do they actually do it?
Imagine a bank that hasn't had a great quarter. Profits are down. They don't want the market to think they're incompetent.
So they try to hide it.
In a way, they might try and make it look like they have high returns, pretend they're doing as well as the top performing banks.
So they cook the books.
No, not that. It's more like they try to find really high risk, high reward projects. If those pay off, they can report huge profits and no one knows the difference.
So they're trying to catch up by taking a huge gamble.
Exactly. But of course, those risky projects could also totally flop. Then they're left with nothing.
Zero profits.
And a damaged reputation. But that fear of being seen as a failure, that's what drives them.
It's all about perception.
Absolutely.
Now, the paper also brings up this idea of strategic interdependence. What's that all about?
Well, basically, it means banks aren't making these decisions in a vacuum. They're watching each other, trying to figure out what the other is doing.
Oh, like a poker game. Trying to guess each other's hands?
Kinda, yeah. If a bank thinks a bunch of other banks are taking these risky gambles to pump up their numbers, the pressure to do the same gets even stronger.
Because if everyone else is faking it, and you're the only one who's honest,
You look even worse. It's like a spiral. Everyone's trying to keep up with this imaginary level of success.
it's all smoke and mirrors.
And it can get really dangerous.
So we've got economic booms, we've got banks taking on huge risks. How do regulators even try to control this whole mess?
That's where macroprudential policy comes in. Specifically, something called counter-cyclical capital adequacy requirements.
What a mouthful. What does that even mean?
Essentially, it's about forcing banks to hold more capital during good times.
Okay, and capital is.
It's basically the bank's own money, their equity, not borrowed funds. The idea is that if banks have a bigger cushion of their own money on hand, they'll be less likely to take crazy risks.
Because they have more skin in the game.
Exactly. They have more to lose if things go wrong. And the paper suggests that this actually works. Higher capital requirements make the gamble for reputation less appealing, because the potential payoff shrinks.
Right, if you're risking more of your own money, you're going to be more careful. Makes sense.
The paper also digs into how banks use different types of information to make their decisions.
So like public and private information.
Yeah. Let's say the true state of the economy is a certain level. Each bank gets its own little glimpse of that, their private information.
But that might not be the whole picture.
Right. It could be flawed, incomplete. Then you've got public information, government data, central bank announcements, that sort of thing, available to everyone.
So banks try to put all of that together, their private view and the public information.
Exactly. They're trying to get the best possible guess of what's really going on in the economy, like putting together a puzzle with some missing pieces.
And then, based on that picture, they decide how much risk to take.
Right. And that's where these countercyclical capital requirements come in. They can actually influence that whole process.
So it's not just about forcing banks to hold more capital. It's about sending a signal, too.
Absolutely. When a regulator says, hey, banks, you need to hold more capital now, even if the economy seems strong, it sends a message.
Like, we see some risks you might be missing.
Exactly. It adds to that public information pool and can make banks think twice about taking those gambles.
Interesting. So how do regulators figure out the right level of capital requirements?
The goal is to find what they call the optimal level. That's the sweet spot that balances two things.
Keeping banks from taking on too much risk.
Right. That's one side of it. But on the other side, you don't want to make capital requirements so high that it strangles lending and hurts the overall economy. Remember, holding all that extra capital costs banks money.
So it's a trade-off.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that this optimal level of capital requirements changes depending on the economy. Specifically, it should be higher when the economy is in that middle ground, not super strong, not super weak.
Why is that?
Well, when the economy is kind of humming along, that's when those reputational pressures are strongest. Banks see their competitors seemingly doing great and they don't want to be left behind, so they're more tempted to take those risky gambles. That's when higher capital requirements can really help put the brakes on things.
But if the economy is already really bad,
Then most banks are probably already struggling, right? There's less incentive to gamble because everyone knows things are tough. So higher capital requirements might not make much of a difference, and they could even hurt by making it harder for banks to lend money.
And what about when the economy is super strong?
That's a tricky one. If things are going incredibly well, the temptation for lower performing banks to gamble might be so strong that even really high capital requirements won't stop them. And then you're just punishing all the well-run banks that don't need to gamble.
So it's like the policy has to be tailored to the specific economic situation.
Precisely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
The paper also mentioned something about moral suasion. What's that?
It's basically when policymakers try to talk banks into behaving themselves, issue warnings, make recommendations, give speeches about potential risks, like, hey, we see what you're doing, don't think you can get away with it.
And that actually works.
Surprisingly, yeah, sometimes it does, especially when the economy is starting to look shaky. A clear public warning from regulators can make banks think twice about taking on too much risk. It can be a powerful nudge in the right direction. The paper even suggests that during good times, it might be better for policymakers to focus on highlighting potential future risks rather than just celebrating the current good times.
That's interesting. So instead of saying, hey, look how great things are, they should be saying, look out, this might not last forever.
Exactly. That way, banks are less likely to get caught up in the hype and make reckless decisions. They might actually think about the long term.
So moral suasion is kind of like adding a psychological element to the regulatory toolkit.
You could say that. It's about managing expectations and perceptions as much as it's about setting rules.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what's the main takeaway from all of this?
I think the big one is that we can't always assume banks act in a purely rational, profit-maximizing way. They're influenced by a lot of other factors, like reputation and the fear of being seen as a failure.
It's like they're playing a game where the rules are constantly changing.
And that can make it difficult to predict their behavior and to regulate them effectively.
So next time you see a bank doing something that seems crazy, maybe take a step back and think about those hidden incentives.
Exactly. There might be more to the story than meets the eye.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Hope you enjoyed this look into the fascinating and sometimes confusing world of bank behavior and macroprudential policy.
If you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out the full paper. It's a really thought-provoking read.
Thanks for joining us.